Hi, this is my rehearsal for the presentation I'm going to give at AIMEcon about test socio-technical artifacts. Uh, I will share my screen now, and I will try to make this presentation in 12 minutes. However, I'm pretty sure this is not going to be enough. I'll try to rehearse and try to make it fast. So, test as socio-technical artifacts. First, thoughts on its implications for validity theory. I wrote a white paper about this idea. I've been working on this like maybe 1 or 2 years already, in which, as I was learning about validity when I was a grad student, I realized that there was some connections with philosophy of technology, and particularly the idea of function, that, in my opinion, was relevant for validity theory, for test validity theory. But I didn't know much about that. So I started to dig more into that literature, and I found this fascinating set of concepts and theories, the double clicking on this idea of function. And weirdly, I found that many of the things that they are talking in that realm have reflection, or is very symmetrical to things that you see in testing. So I wrote this paper kind of like making the connection, making the parallel, and also bringing one specific theory about functions, about specifically about artifacts, and this idea of socio-technical artifacts developed by Cross, which is a professor from Netherlands. And that theory, in my opinion, is capable of configuring some specific type of definitions for what validity is that can bridge this divide that you see sometimes between this idea of test, the validity of the test, and versus the validity of interpretation and uses. That is kind of like two divergent views that Cross' theory of function kind of like, in my opinion, is capable of like bridging this. So the agenda for this presentation, I will speak about more about technology validation and philosophy of technology. I will make the connection with validity theory. I will translating and bridging some of the concepts I found in philosophy of technology to validity, and then I will speak very shortly about the relationship with AI on this. Unfortunately, I won't be able to dig that much more on AI, the AI part, which is maybe weird because we are in a session that is specific about AI. That's the purpose, right? But I think that the preliminary work on this is actually very important for the work that will come about AI and validating particular uses of AI in our field. So if you see the evolution of validity theory, um, I put here like three definitions of validity that, in my opinion, are I don't know, kind of representative of like important views about the topic. And well, I mean, uh, historically, you saw that validity started something more like worried about correlation with criterion variables, or I don't know, like that type of approach in which, well, the validity was more like a correlation. But then validity expanded and included many other sources of evidence. Then at some point we started to speak about facets of validity or types of validity. But then in the 80s we started to speak about like everything is controlled validity, and and these facets are more like sources of evidence, which is the language that is used right now in the standards. And then lately, we have this idea of argument-based approach, in which you need to lay down an argument about uh, the interpretations, the inferences, the actions that you are making with your test. Also, during that time, there was this kind of like dissident view from the Netherlands, and particularly from Professor Denny Borsman, in which he and his colleagues proposed that actually validity is more about the test, and this idea that there is some need to for some ontological aspect of validity, which is not just about like justifying, but also being true, and about things that exist and so on. And he defines this that a test is valid for measuring an attribute if the attribute exists, and also variations in the attribute causally produce variation in the measurement outcomes. So that is a very elegant definition. However, maybe too simple, but still it captures a very important way of looking at validity. That is a property in the artifact test and requires for you to have some ontological commitment that the attribute exists, and also that the causality is kind of like the golden rule to say that a test is measuring. On the other side, you have the American school. So you have Messick, in particular, that he defined validity as an integrated evaluative judgment of the degree to which empirical evidence and theoretical rationales support the adequacy and appropriateness of inferences and actions based on test scores or other modes of assessment. So this definition is a little more complicated. It has a lot of like elements in there. This idea of empirical evidence, theoretical rationales, adequacy and appropriateness, which relates kind of like with values and the scientific part, but also it relates more with the what he calls the evidentiary and consequential basis for supporting interpretation and uses. And this idea of inferences and actions, which is slightly different from the vocabulary we use right now, but it's kind of making something similar idea. So Messick's definition of validity is very loaded, but the more important part is that he understands validity as an evaluative judgment. So it's not a property of the test itself, but is contingent to the inferences and actions, and is a judgment. It's something that is not. It acknowledges that there is some form of like agreement about it among ourselves, but it's not like a divine property existing beyond it's not a mind independent property up to a certain point. The standards are very closer to what Messick defines. And the standard mentioned that validity refers to the degree to which evidence and theory support interpretation of test scores for proposed uses of test. Now, this way of looking at validity is, in my opinion, kind of like polysemic. It can mean many things depending on what you highlight. Because this idea of proposed use of tests is not saying that you need to interpret the use, you need to interpret the interpretation. The interpretation is in a context of use, but it's not, the use is not an object of study within the realm of validity. Eventually, you can include it if you interpret the definition in a wider way, but also you could do it in the opposite direction. So yeah, this idea of like interpretation, uses, the property of the validity is a property of the test or not, etc. Those are part of the landscape of validity theory and the discussions in that realm. Now, on the other side, philosophy of technology is a relatively linear in philosophy. It worries about the relationship between science and technology. And there are two concepts that, in my opinion, are very important, this idea of artifact and this idea of function, that I think they relate a lot with testing. So as I've been learning more about that, I wanted to kind of like bring some of the things that they mentioned and how they apply to testing and the type of testing that now we are doing that is very technological by anyways. And this is the book that I was mentioning, that in which Professor Cross, he mentioned this theory of function or artifact function, in which I am basing all the work I'm giving today. So there are like at least three concepts that the philosophy of technology mentioned: this idea of artifact, of technical artifact, and socio-technical artifact. Artifact is an object that there is some intention of an agent for doing it. So I don't know, like a vase, or here I put a picture of a device that Shannon, a mathematician, created, which is called the useless machine. That is a machine that when you turn it on, it appears like a little hand that turns it off. It's kind of like a silly artifact, but still there is some intention on doing it. A technical artifact is an artifact, but is particularly has this idea of a forness. So you want to do something with this artifact. So I put like tools like, for example, a thermometer that is for measuring temperature, a screwdriver for screwing, from drives like a hammer, and so on. So there is a clear idea of like for what I'm going to do it. And also technical artifacts usually are not just intentionally created, but there is some engineering process in the sense that you need to have like a plan of what you're doing, like a design of what you're doing, and you need to learn more about what you're doing to kind of like have a proper design and so on. And also, such technical artifacts is a technical artifact, but that on top of the material aspect of the artifact, it relies on social elements or social devices, if you want, to its proper functioning. So, for example, a plane, it's material in the sense that there is an artifact, a material artifact, but it's really complicated to actually use that in a wider scale if you do not have humans kind of like articulating how the planes take off or land. And there are rules and there are certifications and there's all this structure that can help basically the proper functioning of this artifact, the material part. Traffic lights are similar. Traffic lights also rely on laws or I don't know, like other things that are beyond the material aspect of the artifact for its functioning. Now, Cross and many others, they when you see like how people speak in philosophy of technology artifacts, they usually tend to concentrate in two groups. Basically, the ones that worry more about the structure of the artifacts, and the others that worry more about the function of the artifact and how it is used. So sometimes you need both to kind of like really understand an artifact because an artifact just by its structure doesn't necessarily tell you what is the function. But if you only know the function, you are not necessarily knowing how exactly you would do an artifact to fulfill that function. So these two aspects of artifacts, the structure and how to use it, and for what, are kind of like inherent to the nature of artifacts. So this duality is one of the theses from Professor Gross on this. And basically it comes from this idea that you have 2 points of view. You can put yourself out there and of the artifact and you put yourself within the artifact. So if you put your observation standpoint within the artifact, then you will worry more about like the parts of the artifact, how they work, etc. But if you're out there, you're more worried about like how people are using this and why it exists. So basically this dual nature comes from this possibility that we can put ourselves in different places. And then you have this idea of function attribution and function ascription that uh, comes from this divide in some way. So attribution, the idea is that there is something inherent in the artifact related to the function that it fulfills. And ascription is more related to something that you put as an agent on an artifact, regardless of why or for how it was designed. If you can use it for something, then you can ascribe function. So basically, function attribution is slightly more closer to the structural part of an artifact and is something that is related to something that is like an intrinsic property of the artifact versus function ascription that is something that is more fluid and can change over time or it is more mind dependent in some way because it depends on the agent that is ascribing a function to something. So for example, a screwdriver and a bread knife. You can screw drives with the tool that is meant to do that, the screwdriver, but also you can use in some cases a bread knife to do the same function. But you see that the screwdriver is designed to do that. However, the bread knife is not designed to do that, but you can ascribe that function to it. And in some cases, actually not all the cases. So you see that sometimes function and structure play weird things because sometimes you have an artifact that has the structural properties, but also artifact that does not have the same structural properties still can make the same function. But are they the same? Not really, because you are not going to call a bread knife a screwdriver just because you could do that a few times. Even if you can systematically do that, still the structural part of the artifact has some relevance. There are many theories about artifact function that actually are kind of like summarized in this book that Professor Croes mentioned, and actually they parallel many of the idea we have in validity theory. So, for example, Cummings' causal view relates a lot with this idea of causality in validity. Searle's status function relates more with Kane. Preston proper function, in my opinion, relates a lot with actually the theory of action. And there is one that's very interesting, it's called the ICE theory, that includes evolutionary aspects of artifacts and kind of like put together all of these. And it's very similar to some of the work that Oliveri and Misledi actually they did for higher education. So it's there in the paper I explain a little bit more about this parallel, and I won't enter too much on that because it's a lot of information. But I will come more directly to the proposal that Professor Cross has for how to define that a functional property is part or belongs to an artifact. So Professor Cross defined this at least three type of function properties: kind proper, use proper, and use accident. So kind proper relates with this idea of function attribution, and basically is a property that is on the artifact. And the condition for saying that an artifact has this kind proper function, basically he lays down the definition to this, that an object S, X, has the functional property of being a phi-er. A phi here is a verb. So in this case, for example, a screwdriver, or I don't know, measurer, like an object for measuring, etc. The object has the functional property of being a measurer in the case of testing, if X is the result of a largely successful execution of a largely correct design for the action that you want. So you see that this idea of a execution and a design are pretty universal in some way for technology validation in general, but those translate to testing and eventually can be used test as one specific instance of a technology, of an artifact function, of a socio-technical artifact actually, that can be attributed a kind proper functional property. On the other side, when you speak about function ascription, and you can have this idea of user proper, user accidental. User proper refers to standardized use of something that is systematic, and use accidental is for one single or not that systematic use of an artifact for a certain function. So Cross mentioned that an agent or group of agents justifiably ascribes to an artifact X the use proper function of being for phi-ing, not for phi-er, but for phi-ing, like measuring, relative to a use plan P for X, if and only if P, the use plan, has been assigned to X by an agent or group of agents that has the appropriate type of social position related to X, and it is both true and socially recognized that there is considerable chance of that competent execution of P will lead to the goal of phi-ing. Here in this definition, the key idea is the idea of a use plan. So basically, when you ascribe function, you are not truly validating the object itself, you're more validating the use plan, like how you're going to use it. And you need to show basically with evidence that competent execution of this use plan will lead to the goal of measuring in a systematic way. So it still is not a property in the artifact, but it still there are conditions for anybody to kind of like say, well, I can repurpose this for this use if I want to, if I can show these things. Also, this idea of like group of agents that have the appropriate type of social position. That is very social constructionist, or I don't know, it has a philosophy of science even that is very continued to the people, you know. I don't think we think in that way much in testing, but I think that's pretty real. So this definition brings a different angle in that regard. One interesting property of these definitions is that each of them are recursive, in the sense that if you have an artifact that has sub-artifact within, you can apply the same definition to each part of the technology. And actually, in testing, in the the fourth edition of Educational Measurement, the book, for the chapter about technology, they just go at all, they mention this idea that these are system of systems. So interestingly, all these concepts can apply recursively to parts of a test that are not necessarily the whole of the test, but still they provide some criteria for how you validate sub-part of a test. So Professor Cross, he mentioned that there is a definition that is more ontological that relates with the kind proper type of function property, and an epistemological that is relating for both the kind proper and use proper functional properties in an artifact. So he creates like different definitions for each case. But interestingly, one observation that Professor Cross makes is that use proper does not provide enough information for declaring that an object is a type of artifact. So I will come back to this later, but basically the implication of this is that from philosophy of technology, they are saying, well, if you want to respond to the question, what is a test? you need to have a definition that is ontological in nature and is related with the kind proper functional property, which is like is making the case for Boltzmann definition in the sense that messic definition is more attuned to ascribing function, but not necessarily to define what do we mean with the word test or what is the kind of artifact that a test is. Actually, Boltzmann definition is that maybe wider than a test because it's like a general scientific measure, which is problematic also in some way. But at least that ontological aspect is kind of like necessary. Then we need like a way to bridge those two definitions. You cannot just stay with messic. In the paper, I wrote this definition, kind of like translating this definition into testing. So instead of like speaking about like a general feature, I'm speaking about a C measure or like a object that measures construct C. And you can use the same definition. You can say that a test is a C measurer if it is the result of a largely successful execution of a largely correct design for measuring construct C. So that is very interesting in my opinion because it also relates with ideas that other people have had about, for example, Professor Bruno Sombo, about this idea of the in vivo and in vitro validity and how it's important to check on the design and as well as the implementation of the test. Philosophy of technology would, at least this view would support that a lot. And actually will make it part of validity as a whole, like it's not just having the good design of a test, but also seeing that it is implemented faithfully and successfully. And also you have more epistemological definitions for the kind proper, use proper, and use accidental, also kind of like making the same translation, also including this idea of use plan and the differentiating between a C measurer and for measuring C, making the distinction between kind proper and use proper. So what are the implications for validity? Well, you need to check design and implementation, and checking the design of the test, I don't think we do that enough. Professor Briggs, he wrote a paper some years ago in which he mentioned actually the idea of the validity more related with the design and another form of validity. So this idea of design in validity is not new completely, but this angle from philosophy of technology would support that you need to, it's not just validating the test in general, you need to validate the design of the test and implementation of the test. Evidence-centered design in some way does that, but I don't think evidence-centered design adds that layer of implementation that clearly. But the layer of design is pretty clear in evidence-centered design. Well, design. Also, this idea of distinguishing between kind proper and use proper. This theory, particular theory of theories of function in artifacts, kind of like gives a way for you to kind of like make peace with this difference between the Dutch school and the American school, because it appears that they will never agree, and maybe they don't agree because they are talking about different things. For starter, they may have different theories of function. So one value of bringing this whole thing of philosophy of technology is that it situates the difference in a better place, in a more accurate place of where is the difference. But also, if you agree with a theory of function that is in common, still that all what you see in philosophy of technology is showing that you cannot have just one type of functional property. You need more than that. So this idea of kind proper and use proper explains why those two branches are never going to really agree, because they are talking about different functional properties. And they are talking because of different functional properties because they have actually very different theories of function for how to consider a test and how to understand function in a test. Also, this idea of like validation, in my opinion, I think we should have a different word for validation in the case of kind proper function and in the case of use proper function. Because use proper is kind of like in retrospective after the fact that you have an artifact. So you don't have much to do with it. So in that case, I think the process of justifying a use plan should be called a retro-validation, because you are retrofitting something into something that is already existing. And well, there is also a very interesting application of all of this to expand this idea of construct irrelevant variance and construct underrepresentation, coming from Messick's ideas into a more general notion of test malfunction. Yeah, here I explain a little bit more like what is validation and what is retrovalidation. Also, I think that in all of this idea of preemptive and anticipatory study is the center of validation for technologies. Having this exposed evaluative thing that is after the fact that you use it is more like an evaluation. That's the vocabulary that they use there. So I also would bring that separation that validation needs to be understood as a preemptive and anticipatory work. And ex post should be evaluation, more like a post-mortem thing. For test validity, basically you have three things that can move. You can have a correct design for a C measurer, you can have the intended design for a C measurer, and you can have the implemented design for the C measurer. So the correct design, actually, you may never know what is the correct design. It's kind of like an idea. And we kind of like try to guess what is it. But then we need to like have some design. So when you put that in a paper, then you have your intended design. And then when you implement that, you may have a very different design that is actually factually done. So the differences between these three moving parts can create different types of malfunctioning. So if the correct design and the intended design are not aligned, I would call that test dysfunctional. But if the intended design and the implemented design is misaligned, then I would call that misfunction. And the same with the other side, parafunctioning, hyperfunctioning. And actually, you can have also the implemented design can move in the good direction, and you can have refunctioning and also proto-functioning as a bad thing. How all of this relate with AI? The final question that maybe is the most important question. I won't be able to talk right now on this. Is that when you use AI, you can also validate that using these ideas. So either you are repurposing something that has already been designed and you are doing function ascription, or you're creating something from scratch and you want function attribution. So maybe for the whole test, each part of the test will need to kind of like go through that process. And if you are creating from scratch, then you need to show that your design is correct, the implementation is also successful. But if you're repurposing, then you need to show what's your use plan and justify why that use plan is reasonable and why it will work. And you can justifiably believe that the successful execution of the use plan will lead to the purpose of whatever is a function of that tool within the system test. And also the idea of that tests have use plans. So that also something that is relatively new and important for all of this. What are next steps? What is validity then? How we will define validity from this point of view with this philosophy of technology? But definitely we need more applied work, kind of like bringing these ideas up and writing technical manuals, writing validity arguments using these ideas. How to validate use plans to repurpose AI tools that I will talk more in another presentation that I will give in another session I already gave. But in the order of the conference, I will give that first. But that's specific about like how you validate use plans, like more specific about that. Because that probably is the most important piece for AI, because we are doing function description over and over with AI. So then what is a use plan? How do you write a use plan? How do you provide evidence for the use plan and so on? And there is this idea of functional requirements that are kind of like stacking. So if you have a function for an artifact, but the artifact is part of another artifact, then the function of the super artifact also becomes a function in some way. So function is not necessarily like a single thing, more like a tower of things. And I think that that is not fully developed in philosophy of technology, but in testing, we know pretty well that problem. So yeah, that's something that probably we need to check out. These are some references, and that's it. I took almost half an hour to explain this, so I will never do this in 12 minutes. Thank you.